and we were in front of the door that said Music Lounge, and the one guy says to the other guy, I worked here 20 years.
Stop.
Anybody in here?
Yeah.
Dr. Mitchell, if you want to go ahead and get started.
Okay.
We're gonna make you look to your left.
Yeah,
No, from over here, I'm just going to launch it that way.
I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm Rebecca. I'm the secretary for Snow. And as you know, Dr. Mitchell is speaking, and he's speaking on the topic of PTSD. So you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to him. I will let him take over.
Okay, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to come in and talk about PTSD. Looking around, I'm not seeing a lot of my former students here. I'm full-time faculty here at the Valparaiso campus for psychology, so a lot of people run into me in that respect. May have had some of you in online classes, but my experience historically, I used to do a lot of therapy with adults. I started out working with kids, got into working with adults, and now I specialize in working with people with developmental disabilities who are also comorbid with psychiatric issues. And so it's been a little while since I've actually worked specifically with PTSD, but it's one of those disorders that the prevalence rate is going up. And as medical professionals, you're going to see a lot of individuals with PTSD. And unfortunately, you're going to see the PTSD probably as a byproduct of what you're really working with. Because it is something that is comorbid with so many different things. For those of you that possibly, how many of you have done your psychiatric rotation? So not too many. But this is something that we tend to see a lot of in psychiatric hospitals where it's not the major problem, but it's the underlying problem. And so what I want to do is I want to introduce what PTSD is, what it looks like, and where you're most likely to see it. I don't like to get bogged down with statistics. If you're really into statistics, I can give them to you. I've always found that that's not the most intriguing thing to hear about when we're talking about psychiatric issues. So let me just start out by giving you just the briefest of history of what PTSD is. PTSD is considered to be one of the newest old issues we have in psychology and psychiatry, meaning that we've had it around since before psychology and before psychiatry. We've known about it. But it was only in the DSM-3 around 1980 when we started really seeing it as considered to be a psychiatric issue. Before that, it was considered to be kind of a military issue. And it had some really fun old names. It wasn't fun if you had the issue, but shell shock, war fatigue, battle neurosis. It was basically, for the longest time, considered to be this huge issue, but it wasn't seen as mental illness. Unfortunately, it was seen as weak will. You have guys coming back from war. You think about World War I and World War II, where people were literally fighting face to face with other people, and these guys were coming back, and they were in this what we consider today to be PTSD, and they were looked upon as being weak-willed soldiers. And I mean that just seems almost horrific as we look at PTSD today. Fast forward to the 1980s, and we start to see PTSD being not only something seen in the military, but it's also something that is starting to be discovered in the general population. And then when we fast forward again to DSM-4, around 1995, we introduced a second PTSD-ish diagnosis called ASD, which is something you don't normally hear about, but it's actually more common. It's, for those of you that have taken abnormal psych, you'll remember this weird disorder called dysthymia. Does anybody remember dysthymia? Dysthymia is essentially the common cold of mood disorders. I call it the Eeyore disorder. So Eeyore, everybody knows Eeyore? Okay. Eeyore does not have clinical depression, right? He is not, I don't think Eeyore is suicidal, but he's constantly in a funk, right? We don't need to admit him to say anything, but he's not the guy that you go to if you want to pick me up. And that's dysthymia. And we see dysthymia way more than depression, but what a majority of people with mood disorders are diagnosed with is depression, because we don't understand depression. That's kind of the same thing with PTSD and ASD. ASD is acute stress disorder. Commonly, if you want a way to remember it, it's final exam week disorder. Okay? You're all coming up on finals, right? Or I would mispronounce your big test. What is your guys' that? Yeah, okay. I'm guessing just by saying those letters and that word, I just induced ASD in some of you.
Oh, yeah, for me and Pam especially for last semester.
Yeah. Cold sweat. Shut up, don't talk about it, let's move on, okay? I'm eating my lunch, I don't want to bring it back up. So what acute stress disorder is basically like, it's something that is going to come and go, but it's bringing out the distress, the same thing as PTSD. PTSD, full-blown PTSD, has something that is much longer in duration and is much more clinically significant. Okay, so we're going to see a lot more ASD, but for the most part, people are usually, if they're treated for PTSD. Why is that? Simply because ASD tends to run its course. How do you treat, again, finals are coming up. And if all of you came to me and said, we need a group because we all have ASD, my treatment would be, okay, let's take you through the finals, and then guess what? It goes away. The difference is PTSD doesn't tend to go away. I would assume most of you, once you graduate from here at Ivy Tech and you're out, you're being awesome nurses and you're in the medical field, you do not wake up 10 years from now in cold sweat and like, oh my God, finals. If you do, you have some nasty professors, okay? Because you kind of get away from it, and that's acute stress disorder, where PTSD, if you did have, just the worst type of professor in the world, you may wake up 10 years from now in a cold sweat because of finals from that time, okay? And I hope Ivy doesn't employ anybody who does that. I would assume not. But PTSD really is something that is based upon a true trauma, okay? Prevalence rates, I told you I wouldn't involve you now with statistics, but just a little bit. Lifetime prevalence rate, about 10% of people will develop something in the realm of PTSD throughout their life. Okay, does that mean that 10% of people are going to seek out treatment? No. Does that mean that 10% of people are going to be debilitated? No. What that means is that most, 75 to 80% will have a trauma in their life that could bring about PTSD. About 10% of those people are going to actually develop PTSD. So 70% of people are going to have the trauma and not develop PTSD. What is the difference in that big group? Depends who you ask. If you ask a Freudian, they would say that they have better coping mechanisms. If you ask somebody who's more of a social psychologist, they would say they have better support systems. If you look at a cognitive person, they would say that the person isn't thinking about it all the time. There's no one answer. But for people who have a trauma, to develop PTSD, it's something significant in them. And it doesn't even matter what the severity of the trauma is. Some people may develop PTSD from something that other people will look at them and say, that is really benign. That is really, why are you freaking out over that? You get into a finger bender. I remember the first car crash I was ever in, my grandma was driving me home. She was turning to go into our laneway, and somebody decided to pass her instead of pass her on the level we were turning left. Okay? I could have developed PTSD from that. I could have been like, every time I see my grandma driving, I go, oh crap. And in all honesty, I probably should have, because grandma was getting old. But not a bummer, she was a good driver. She was still okay at that point. I could have developed that. I could have developed PTSD based upon turning into my own laneway. Like every time I go to turn, I start to have these symptoms, but I didn't. Some people can be in that exact same wreck and develop PTSD. There's no rhyme or reason to it. And we can't really predict. There's no test to give soldiers to see, which soldier is going to go out and develop PTSD. I'm going to hit on soldiers quite a bit because this is kind of the group that we throw into trauma. Literally, it's in their job description. We are going to take them and throw them into traumatic situations. But I think the way that the military and the world has changed, soldiers are developing PTSD way less frequently than what they did in the past. We don't have any statistics from World War I and World War II, but we do know that if we look at people from 1980 to 2005 that were soldiers in Vietnam, nearly 50 to 60% of them developed PTSD. We look at people coming back from the Gulf War I, Gulf War II. We don't have good statistics yet from the current battles, but we're at about 10 to 12%. Okay? And there's a lot of theories. I mean, I'm not a historian, but I know enough about the difference between Vietnam and Gulf War I to know that there was a lot of things. There was a lot more hand-to-hand combat. There's a lot more entrenchment in Vietnam versus the Gulf War. Not to diminish what our military people were doing, but we were doing a lot more lobbing of missiles. Whereas in Vietnam, people going to the jungle, and that would give me PTSD because I have a huge fear of snakes, and so I would have been opting out at that point. I'm not really. So we see that there is a decrease, but we're also seeing an increase in the general population. And this is one where men, this is very, almost, I almost want to say rare, it's not rare, but it's statistically significant to note that men get diagnosed with PTSD almost 6 times as much if you include military. If you take military out, it's about 50-50. But going into practice or seeing people coming in, you're more likely to see a man with PTSD than you are a female if you're taking into account the entire population. The number one thing for both men and women, and this is taking into account everybody in the population of the United States. Can anybody take a wild guess what is the same for men and women? What is the number one trigger for PTSD?
Sexual assault?
Sexual assault and rape. Yep. Both men and women. When you go to number 2, it changes a little bit. For women, number 2 is molestation and abuse. For men, it is, I think it's physical attack is non-sexual. But PTSD is the number one thing that is kind of triggering this is sexual assault and rape. And we do know from statistics that the difference between the number one correlation of PTSD in men when it comes to sexual abuse also has a correlate with what life activity. Where do most men, where do most sexual assaults from men occur? Yeah, prison system. So we see PTSD heavily in the prison system, and it's very underdiagnosed and undertreated. So what we're seeing most of are people who are coming out of the prison system. If you see a history of being incarcerated, a lot of times that PTSD can come from that. And so the lifetime prevalence again about 10 to 12. Let's make sure I'm getting all the big ideas here. Let's talk about what PTSD actually is. Prior to about the year 2000, 2001, PTSD was heavily, kind of a heavily guarded diagnosis. You had to really almost prove yourself in order to get the diagnosis of PTSD. You had to experience something firsthand, or else it was kind of dismissed as a diagnosis. And around the mid-90s to early 2000s, there started to be this vicarious notion of PTSD, where you didn't have to actually experience the PTSD, you could actually just be a witness to something traumatic. And this became very, very heavily researched following the year 2001. What happened in 2001 was very traumatic. 9/11. And if you were old enough to really kind of experience that, live with that, every year that I teach, I get less and less students who I can relate to. I'm like, wow, okay, so you were in kindergarten, awesome. Makes me feel old. But if you remember people, at 9/11, for days, that was a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I can remember just being glued to the television. One of my favorite media kind of non-scientific things to reference is South Park. And South Park did an awesome interpretation of this where one of the kids' moms were sitting at 9/11 on the couch and just staring at the TV for like 4 days. And a lot of people developed PTSD symptoms based upon the fact that, again, I remember that day very vividly because for the first 12 hours, you couldn't change the channel, every channel, MTV, ESPN, they all created with this, and they just kept showing the planes on the moon. And then after one day, they kind of stopped. They kind of figured out, hey, we don't need to see this over and over and over. So for that first day, you just got numb to it. And I can remember talking to some peers, and people in rural Indiana were just petrified of planes attacking rural Indiana. And if you look back and think about it, it's like, okay, so they went after major places, the Twin Towers, the Pentagon. At that time, I was in Kokomo, Indiana. I don't think that's a hotbed for being attacked. However, it was rational because we kept seeing it over and over. And so with PTSD, that would be more acute stress disorder. But if with PTSD, you have people who are reliving the experience over and over and over in times that don't really make sense, okay? So the one person that I treated, I rarely when I was in clinical practice working with adults, I didn't get a lot of PTSD, but I actually got one guy that he he had probably the best example of this that I can kind of give you an idea of what PTSD actually looks like when it kind of comes to full steam. This is a gentleman who was going to the VA. He had been in Gulf War II, and went to the VA, and VA, he was not happy with that. So he came in, and we were working, and he was an over-the-road truck driver. And he was a reservist for the Army, didn't think he'd ever go, got pulled up for 2 active duties. And when he was over in Afghanistan, he was a truck driver, convoy driver, so that was his job. So one day they're driving, and they go under some form of underpass. And as their convoy is under this huge underpass, the only way I can describe it is if you've seen The Godfather. Maybe you've seen it. A couple of you. So car pulls out in front of the convoy in the underpass, and another car pulls behind and traps the convoy under this underpass, which is very similar to the toll scene in Godfather. And they open fire. And the gentleman that I'm sitting and talking with was the only person to survive. There was 3 trucks, and everybody were killed during this. He was the driver. He jumped under the steering wheel, got shot a few times, but he survived. So he was honorably discharged, came back, and everything seemed to be okay. He was very happy to be back. Went back to his job, and his job was to drive from South Bend to Cleveland twice a day, back and forth, back and forth. And so if you've ever been on the toll road, you know that there are underpasses. He was driving fine for about 2 months, and one day he's driving with his one of those triple FedEx trucks, and he's driving back and forth, and he comes to an underpass, and he hits the brakes and stops, and he pulls over, and he just starts falling, and he can't figure out what's going on. So police come over, and they kind of surround him, and he's sitting in his truck, bawling his eyes out. He can't talk. Police don't know what's going on. They assume, what's your first assumption? Drugs, yeah. And fortunately, they kind of get together with what's going on. He's able to describe it, and they have to call another truck driver to take the load the rest of the way. They take him back. He can't do it. PTSD is the irrationality of the memory coming back. Is it possible on the toll road in Indiana that you might be ambushed? Is it possible? Yes. Is it likely? No. When he got calmed down and he went to what used to be Madison Center, and he told us, I know for a fact that I was safe on that road. I knew it. I just could not hit the gas. I couldn't do it. He said, and every time I went to do it, every time I tried to push myself through, I just kept envisioning that point where things went wrong in the past. And that's PTSD. It is vivid remembering, vivid recounting, and the worst part about it is, hopefully, you can harken back to Psych 101, and you can remember how awful the human memory actually is. It's awesome. It is awesome. It's untaxable. You can't fill it up, even if you're studying for finals. You can't fill up your brain. And it never tends to go away, but human memory has this awful, awful fault. 2 big faults for PTSD. One, most of our memories are coded in a way that it is both cognitive memories and emotional memories. And they kind of get coded together. So when you pull out a cognitive memory, you tend to get this emotional memory coming back with it, which is really cool if you have good memories. Think back to the birth of a child, or a birthday party, or a wedding, as long as you're still happy. But think about it. Think about this. Don't want to bring up any bad memories, but think about the fact that if you have a relationship that has ended poorly, like if you have a marriage that goes bad, if I asked you a week after your marriage, like, how was your wedding? It was wonderful. It was the greatest thing ever. So beautiful. Everything was awesome. 3 years down the road, 5 years down the road, divorce. Then I asked you a couple weeks after the divorce, tell me about your wedding. Oh my God, it was the worst day of my life. And why? Because you're encoding with this new memory, this new idea of what was actually happening. So that's the first thing that sucks about human memory, is that we kind of get convoluted. The second thing is, every time we pull a memory out, it's not like watching a DVD. Because if it was a DVD, we pull the memory out, it would go back in, and we pull it out the same the second time. The big fault with human memory is that every time we pull it out, we re-encode it back in. Okay? So if you're listening to a lecture, you're listening to this right now, and in a week somebody says, hey, what did that guy talk about? And you were to say some things, and you get a few facts mixed up. Once you say it, once you believe it, it goes back into your memory, and you've re-encoded it in the incorrect way. This is where, nothing to do with PTSD, but if you ever get to an argument argument with somebody you live with and you both know you're absolutely right, in your brains, if I put you up to a polygraph test, you both would be right. You're both not lying. It's because we've encoded things incorrectly back in. And so PTSD is essentially, we take all that negative stuff that we associate with an event, and we pin it with a triggering, an activating event. And when we pull that activating event out, we get all the crap with it, okay? So PTSD becomes incredibly problematic because not only is that one little activating event going to trigger all these emotions, but emotions can trigger the activating event. So even if you're just having a bad day, you're actually going to pull that memory out, you're going to associate it, you're going to keep thinking about that bad event. If you have a smell, this is what I think happened with my gentleman in the car. I think probably it was the smell of diesel plus the sight of an underpass, and all these things flooded, and he pulled out, I'm going to be attacked. Again, some of these things are awesome because you smell something and you have a really good feeling. That's awesome, but PTSD is bad because it kind of sucks everything back in. Now, for you guys, the thing you need to kind of remember is there's a very high comorbidity between drug abuse and PTSD. Primarily, 50% of people with PTSD suffer from alcoholism. And this becomes the chicken or the egg thing. Are they drinking to try to stifle the PTSD? Or are they trying to stifle the PTSD and therefore they start drinking? That's your main question, especially if you're going to be doing psychiatric rotation or working, even if you're just working generally in the medical field, that you're going to run across this. And the reason that you have to figure out which one's the chicken, which one's the egg, and which one came first is because you can treat one and it won't kill the other. You have to treat the underlying cause. If I have PTSD because, and I use alcohol to treat it, if you take away my alcohol, if you cure my alcoholism, what am I probably going to do? I still have PTSD. If I don't want to do alcohol, yeah, I've heard heroin works pretty well too. Don't do drugs, but it works, right? Now, if I have alcoholism and I get PTSD from somewhere else and I just keep drinking, maybe treating alcoholism might be the right thing to do, but it's not necessarily going to work specifically. So, what is the differentiation here between somebody who has PTSD and somebody who has just a bad memory? Because we all have things that if I were to bring it up to you, you would have a bad response, right? Everybody's had a bad situation. Everybody's been in a car wreck or been in a fight, and if I were to ask you to think about it, you have a bad visceral response. So what's the difference between PTSD and just having a crappy memory? And for those of you that have taken abnormal, this should ring a bell. There's 4 things that we look at. We look for the 4 Ds. Does that ring a bell for anybody? 4 Ds? Danger, distress, deviousness, and dysfunction. Okay? Danger, let's go back to my guy who was driving the truck. Is it dangerous for him to hop into a truck now knowing what he knows? Kind of. I don't want to be on the road with him if he starts to freak out. So, a little bit dangerous. Dangerous to himself, yes. Is it distressing? Yeah, that's the whole point of PTSD. Is it deviant? Yes, because we already said that only 10% of people are going to develop out of that 80% West trauma. But the big one is dysfunction. Is it causing this gentleman dysfunction in his life? Absolutely. That's the thing that tends to tip somebody over from, I have a bad memory, and I have a bad response to, I have PTSD. Because if you think about it, you have PTSD until you walk in and seek treatment, or you get forced into treatment, which is what normally happens. You have it, but do you really? Not really, because it's only at the point where there's dysfunction, and most people don't go and seek out treatment, especially psychiatric, when they first have that first symptom. Somebody wakes up like, I'm a little more depressed than I was yesterday, but I'm still functioning. I need to go see a psychiatrist. No, most people go when, in addictions, we call it rock bottom, right? So PTSD, that guy, my assumption, and I don't know the answer to this, but again, the gentleman that I'm using as the example, my guess is that he's had some symptoms before. He's seen that underpass and he's had some, but it wasn't until it was dysfunctional that he actually sought out treatment. And so, what do we want to do with people with PTSD? There's 2 different areas that we want to look at. The first is somebody who's actively symptomatic and somebody who's not actively symptomatic. The person who's actively symptomatic, we basically want to try to calm them down. Okay? That may be simply, again, going back to my example, maybe pulling them out of the truck and sending them home for the day. You know, that's not going to treat them. That's not going to cure them. And as we know in psychiatry and almost all medicine, do we ever cure anything in psychiatry and psychology? No, we reduce symptoms. So the acute person who's having this disorder, we're going to pull them out of the situation and try to get them calmed down. Long term, we have to look at what kind of treatments are effective. First thing we have to realize is medication for PTSD is not the most effective thing. Now, it is very effective. So I'm going to talk out both sides of my mouth. It is very effective. However, PTSD people, they don't need medication every day. Because are they going to be symptomatic every day? No. So we just want to give them a PRN for when they're starting to have symptoms. Well, we do, but theoretically, yes. If we could just sit there and jab them quickly and say, boom, we're done. But if we want to keep people from being medicated 24/7, we're going to be treating symptoms that aren't actually there at all times. Now, I see you're kind of perplexed by this.
No, I just have some experience with this, so I was kind of wondering where you were going.
Okay, so let me tell you where I'm going with it and then try to see if it matches up, okay? Because the goal in psychiatry, as a non-psychiatrist, so I can just kind of speak to what the goal theoretically academically is. We don't want to treat something that's not symptomatic at the time, okay? So with PTSD, I may experience symptoms, let's say 1 time a week. So for 6 days out of the week, I'm taking some type of mood stabilizer or antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication that is basically treating symptoms that aren't there. And then when the symptoms come about, if I'm on a maintenance dosage of an anti-anxiety medication, it's probably not going to treat the actual, what would be similar to a panic attack in that moment, okay? So that's where I'm not saying that medications won't work. I'm saying that we're treating something that's not there, and then when it finally comes there, the medications that we gave aren't going to be nearly as effective as what they need. Okay? So I think I misspoke a little bit when I said it's not effective, but it's treating something that isn't always there.
Yeah.
It'd be like if I woke up every day and took Tylenol migraine because I get a migraine once a month. Okay? Now, preventatively, it's not a bad thing, but almost every treatment plan that I've ever seen talks about titration. How can you titrate something that is not treating the symptoms because we can't see the symptom reduction? It's a long and arduous way of thinking about things. Treatment plans are kind of the bane of psychiatric existence because we're always trying to titrate drugs. We're always trying to treat symptoms, and the symptoms kind of are subjective. But the second type, so with medication, we know that it's available, but a lot of times if we do it as a PRN, it's going to be too late. It's like a panic attack. Most people don't realize that a panic attack is going to be awful until it's already past the point. And then medication basically just gives them a tranquilizer to kind of calm them down. There are cognitive behavioral and other types of therapies that work relatively well. And then there's some bizarre, I'm going to call it bizarre because we can't really tell why it works, but it does work. And the treatment that has shown a lot of efficacy is this treatment called EMDR. You've heard of EMDR before? It's really a cool treatment if it's done correctly. If not, it's just kind of hokey. And so to kind of visualize what EMDR is, eye movement EMDR, desensitization and reprogram. Okay? So we all know that the brain has 2 hemispheres, right? Left and right. And as we tend to think, we use the left and right hemispheres for different parts of the brain. So this is all theoretical. It's not 100% scientific, but anecdotal evidence says this is a pretty effective treatment. How many of you have ever had something going on in your head, and you're trying to make a decision, and so you go for a walk, and somehow it comes to you, okay? One of the theories of this is because as you're walking, your brain is bilateral, and the information, as you're walking back and forth, thoughts are shifting back and forth in your mind, and it allows both sides of your brain to kind of contemplate what's going on. EMDR is set up, and it looks like old-fashioned hypnosis. Like, if you think of hypnosis back in the day, you think about a Svengali guy with a pocket watch going back and forth. What EMDR is, essentially uses that same thing. It has you watch, you can do it with a finger, you can do it with a metronome, you can do it with all kinds of things. But you basically go back and forth, and you have the person track with their eyes, back and forth, and as they do that, they recount the trauma. They bring the trauma back up, they think about it. Now, if I just had the person recount the trauma, they would sit there, and as they're recounting it, if they have PTSD, what's going to happen? They're going to start to have symptoms. They're going to start to get all amped up. As they're tracking and they're going back and forth, you would work with that person to talk about the event and then get them to calm down. Talk about the event, get them to calm down as they're reprogrammed. So remember what I said about memory. Every memory we have, we bring back up and put back in. We're trying to reprogram that person to think about that traumatic event, that trigger, without correlating it and pairing it neurologically with the emotion of fear and anxiety. That's about as scientific as I can go with this, because the research has shown that it anecdotally it works, but there's all types of different theories as to why it works. And so we can't say exactly, like, this is the reason it works. The way that I've interpreted it is basically memory. It's bringing memory, putting it back in, bringing memory out, putting it back in. And there has been anecdotal and research evidence to show that you can actually take this too far. That there have been people who have done EMDR to the point where they have desensitized that particular traumatic event to the point where they no longer elicit any type of emotion. They do so much EMDR that you could get the person to say, yeah, I was in that convoy that blew up, yeah, it was probably pretty bad, it doesn't seem that bad anymore. Shouldn't we have a little bit of response to that? You want to keep your human side, but there have been people who have experienced severe trauma, sexual abuse and rape, and where EMDR, they kept going and going because it felt better and better, and all of a sudden they're just flattened in their affect based upon this. Anecdotally, is it just the simple fact that they kind of numb themselves by talking about it over and over? Possible. Could it be that EMDR is a bunch of crap? Possible. But the anecdotes show that it's working pretty well. And then, just to kind of bring in what you might be, if you read about PTSD in the last year, one of the most popular new interventions, and this is all psychiatry. Dogs, actually, that is one. There's been a lot of evidence to show that having a dog is just an awesome thing no matter what. But two things, dogs can be there to kind of be a support system. And secondly, dogs have this amazing ability to be almost predictive. I have a client who has severe epilepsy, and the dog's been trained to kind of be able to smell when that's happening. There's not really a scent, I don't think, to PTSD, but they've been training dogs to be able to predict when there might be something and they give more support. That is a very popular one right now. The other big one right now, it's a medication. Pot. Yeah. THC and I think it's DHC. It's the non-THC aspect of marijuana. They've been using it for epilepsy, and they've been showing that it does have effectiveness in people with PTSD, and it does not have the hallucinogenic or mood-altering effects. Most of that research is not coming from the United States because it's still Schedule I. But in Canada, there's been a lot of usage of that. So when we look at what PTSD, the possibilities of the future, there is a lot of hope in the fact that there may be some pretty good treatments. I'm not a real big THC pot person for treatment because we can't see the evidence in the United States. It's still a Schedule I drug. And the number one group of people that we have to actually experiment on is through the VA. And if one group is not going to experiment with marijuana, it's the VA, because they're completely different countries. So it's going to be difficult. We're going to have to take European and Canadian research and kind of vet it out. But it's seen as the possible effective treatment for PTSD. Okay. I've been yammering now for about 40 minutes. Questions?
I had a question as far as like how long can they be in acute phase?
Acute phase up to 1 month. ACD, or ASD is considered anything up to a month, and then after a month, you're going to be looking at either something else or PTSD if you can point to the traumatic event. And you can have recurring acute stress disorder, and so that is kind of contradictory. But if you're just the kind of person who overreacts to certain situations, it's very problematic for most clinicians, almost all clinicians, to figure out whether you're dealing with acute stress disorder or panic attacks, because they look the same. Acute stress disorder is normally where we can pinpoint an antecedent, where a panic attack is coming out of nowhere. So, but you can stay in there clinically for a month, and then if you pop back out and you're fine, you go back in, that's still going to be ASD. It's more so when we look at if there's like one traumatic event, then we look at PTSD. Even if that one event has been going on like cyclically for a long time. I worked with a gentleman who, when he was a child, he was abused horrifically. From age 1 to 6, he was abused in every which way that you could possibly think. And so, yeah, we consider that to be one traumatic experience. It's not like 100 of them. And so his PTSD is based upon like his childhood. And that's horrible to say, but there's 5 years of development there where he was being traumatized, and so his PTSD stems from that.
Is it known, or are there any theories, what part of the brain causes triggers a PTSD attack?
There is a theory that people who have an overactive amygdala are more prone to experience PTSD. And I'm going to reference old, disgusting, awful, racist research, simply because it helps us understand. And I hate talking about some of these but they exist, and so I'm not going to pretend like they don't exist. Research back in the 40s and 50s were done on different races, Caucasian, Latino, African American, Asian American, and they found that just purely looking at activity, that African Americans their amygdala tends to fire off more frequently and more intensely during certain events. And then we look at the fact that soldiers coming back, if we go apples to apples, we have more African Americans who experience PTSD than any other race in the United States. And so you put those two things together, and there's a theory that because their amygdala is more active, they may be more prone to PTSD. Couple that with the fact that when we look at just behavioral issues, people who are more prone to fight. So soldiers are usually fighters, but if you look at history, childhood history, were they conduct disorder type kids? People who have more of a proclivity to engage in violent activity tend to engage more, have more PTSD growing up. And so correlational completely, but the correlation is that possibly the amygdala is not allowing the frontal lobe to make a determination that I'm not really in a fight or flight situation. That when I'm getting stimulated and I have a memory, the amygdala fires off, and just the frontal lobe, you can't tell somebody with PTSD, just calm down, take 10 deep breaths, and think you're safe, you're safe, you're safe. It doesn't work. Their amygdala is just firing off too hard.
So is that the theory that is used to choose a medication for a particular person?
It can. This is an amazing thing that we're just now looking at, but beta blockers are being shown to be highly effective for PTSD. And the reason that nobody's doing high research on this is because beta blockers have been around forever.
I had a patient in my rotation who was on propranolol for panic attack.
I think that's for panic attack.
And so what's the reason why we're not getting a lot of research on that, particular like beta blockers, particularly like that, is because beta blockers, yeah, they're way off patent.
Yeah.
So who wants to spend $2 billion getting an FDA approval for something that everybody and their brother can go out and produce? There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but we're never going to see FDA approval saying beta blockers are awesome for PTSD because there just isn't a market for it. And you'll never make your money back. I mean, it would have to be the most altruistic pharmacy company out there. Ben & Jerry's pharmaceutical, I don't know what it would be, but we're just not going to see it. But a lot of doctors are throwing beta blockers and it's tending to be effective. And that's not even just PTSD, that's schizoaffective, conduct disorder kids.
She was schizoaffective.
Yeah. And most doctors want to throw things like Invega at schizoaffective because that's the big one right now.
Yeah.
But beta blockers, low doses of beta blockers are showing to be just as effective as some of these newer psychotropic meds. So that's where they're looking at the medications. if a doctor is in the know about research, they may be looking at beta blockers. If they're just simply listening to their rep, they're going to use the new, whatever's out there. It's nice information. I think it's psychiatrist, but I wish I could get those so your hand pop up? Yeah. I see a lot of PTSD in the medical field, but I don't see it in the clinical sense. I see a lot of, perfectly honest, I see a lot of people in the medical field who have PTSD but squash it. Push it down. Because think about it, you are vicariously experiencing trauma constantly. I think the group that probably has the most PTSD and is the least researched and the least treated and the most dismissed are first responders and EMTs. Because they're getting the dirtiest, they're getting it right in the field. And for like ER and emergency room and hospital, you can dissociate yourself just a little bit because I'm in the hospital, ergo, this is only happening here, I can go home and it's not the real world. EMTs go out to the real world and see all this stuff, and then it's on their way home that they see wherever it is happening. So I see a lot of people in the first responders that probably do have PTSD. They use their own coping mechanism. And if a medical professional does develop PTSD, it's going to be very easy to figure out because you're going to notice yourself removing yourself from certain stimuli. If you have an event that just hits too close to home, like you have somebody come in and you kind of put yourself in a situation, or somebody who looks like a loved one, or the situation feels like a loved one, a lot of people, this will be, if unchecked, can be kind of the end of a career. And a lot of people won't even fully acknowledge it. They'll say, oh, I'm burnt out. But in actuality, they're burning out on specific events.
Yeah, like this thing with dying. I'm trying to work on it.
No. I want you to think about dying. I want you to be my personal nurse. Because I want you to keep me alive. Okay? If you don't have that, let it go.
I'm just getting late now, and I remember my very first time when a patient passed away on me. You have to go in and think the body or whatever. But when I looked at his face, I was just kind of feeling up. When I looked at his face, his eyes were looking right at me, his mouth open, and I'm just like, I couldn't finish. Like I was shaking, I had to get out there. So every time now, I'm better at it now. But when a patient passes away, I'm like, you gotta come here with me because it flashes back. Sometimes I would have nightmares about this man looking at me.
And you know what? I'm going to diagnose you as human. Because there will be a point where you'll become desensitized to it. I'm quite certain of it. But if the first, it would scare me more if you were like the first time you walk in, it's like, yeah, dead body. You're in the field for a weird reason. It's okay. You gotta know your work. But yeah, I mean that's acute stress disorder. Because let's be honest, fresh nurses, fresh therapists, fresh anybody are going to have acute stress. It's going to freak you out. I would think that a stockbroker, the first time they lose $1 million in the stock market of their company's money, that should freak them out. First time you have somebody die, the first time I lose a client, it feels bad. For me, the first time I had a depressed client who committed suicide, it took a ton out of me, and you can't prepare for it. There's no textbook, there's no lecture, there's nothing that will actually make you understand what it's like to sit and question what you did, what happened. And that's acute stress disorder. If you get over it, good. If it keeps coming back and back and back and back, and you can't work with the person because they have depression now, that's probably PTSD. So, and the biggest thing is, in my field, we call it supervision. I don't know if you guys have clinical supervision on a consistent basis, but even at the top of your field, even if you're at the very top of your field, you find a colleague and you do clinical supervision. Like I do it once every 2 weeks at a minimum. It's basically therapy for me. And I would never want anybody to sit in on my clinical supervision because it would sound like I'm the most evil person in the world. Because there are certain people that I work with, and there are situations where you kind of have to laugh about it, and you have to cry about it, you have to think about it. I don't want to be walking around and talking about, oh, I have this movie client, wacky and they do all these weird things, that sounds awful, but with another clinician, we have to let it out. We have to have that moment of levity. Laugh about it, people feel later. And so if you don't have a clinical supervisor, you need to invest in a good person to talk to, maybe another person in the same field, and where you're going to talk about things, you're going to let it out. It's going to be letting out your tension. You kind of let it out, and then you can move on. Bottling it up, from a professional standpoint, bottling it up, I don't care how big your bottle is, it will eventually explode. It's like you can have the biggest bottle of Diet Pepsi in the world. That's your emotional intake. Somebody needs to drop one Minto in there, and what happens? You get the explosion, right? Now you never know what that one Minto is. That one Minto could just be walking in and seeing something that you didn't expect. So you have to find somebody to kind of let it out to a professional skill. Don't go into like with a group of friends.
Jim Beam and Jose Cuervo.
You know what? I'm not opposed to supervision with those guys. Just make sure that you're not amongst mixed company. Confidentiality. Other questions, comments, concerns, thoughts?
What's your ability to go back to work if you have PTSD or the last month?
It all depends on the individual. I know it's a cop-out. I mean, if you have full-blown PTSD where you have a traumatic experience that is job-related, most of the time I would make the recommendation to find a different area. Because if it's truly PTSD, like if you're a surge tech and for some reason watching something get opened up is going to bother you, there's not a lot you can do outside of what you're doing, so you try to find something alternative. The rate at which somebody can actually re-enter, it's very rare that somebody actually has to check out of life for PTSD for an extended period of time. Except for those times like people coming back from war where they maybe check out of life and transition back into the real world. But people who just have a traumatic experience and kind of have those vivid flashbacks, they just feel off. Most people can work through that with outpatient therapy and maybe some low-grade medications and some good coping skills coming from there. It's usually not the end of the world for people. It's usually something that you just identify, you work through, and everything kind of works out.
But your truck driver, was he able to ever go back to truck driving, or did he choose a different?
He went back to truck driving almost immediately, but he switched his route. He went from South Bend, Cleveland, to South Bend, Indy, which
Less bridges? Less bridges?
less bridges. Back at this time, they didn't have the new 31, so there were probably Indy.
It's all bridges now.
Yeah, now he couldn't pull that off. But I do believe that he eventually went back to his old route after about a year. So it's not like it took him some time. I know that he sought out a person who was credentialed in EMDR and actually went through that. I didn't keep up with him for a long period of time, but I do believe he actually went back to his old route. It wouldn't have been, I wouldn't call him like I wouldn't say there was an issue if he never went back to that route. Because that route would now be a new PTSD for him. Seeing that one place like, oh my God, this is where I had my breakdown. It has nothing to do with the ambush that started it, but now it's like, that's where I had my breakdown. Every time he's coming up to that underpass, it's going to be, this is where I had my breakdown. I remember my breakdown, the cops were there, and it was a bad situation. All of a sudden, you had a new trigger. It wouldn't have hurt if you just avoided that altogether. A lot of times we think, well, that's kind of, it's an easy way out, but guess what? You don't have to go into that underpass. Don't go into that underpass. Let's not poke the bear. So
That's with medication then, probably? Or?
he was on medication. He was on a very low dose of Buspar, and that just kind of helped level him out. If I were him, I probably, if I wanted to go back on that whole route, I would, the days that I was going to go under that underpass, I might give myself a little PRN going over. But that may actually become a trigger. You can actually contradict the medication by, if I take 2 Buspars that morning, now I'm taking 2 Buspars because I know that I'm going to be in a situation where I might have my PTSD symptoms, and all of a sudden I'm taking 2 meds, actually contradicts the 2 meds that you took. So it's a big vicious circle. There's no happy shot that we can get. Not to mention the fact, and I didn't want to bore you with this, but when we look at neuroeconomics, there's new research to show that our decision-making processes are not even our own for the most part. The brain actually makes decisions before we know what decision we are going to make, and then the only thing our consciousness is doing is rationalizing what the neurology already said. Yeah, it gets very intense when you start looking at how the brain is actually working. So in that case, you look at the whole question of free will, and do we really make decisions, and so how can you stop the brain before you can build a brain-based decision? That's a rabbit hole we can't get out of. I'll leave that to people who have more fun with it. All right, anything else? Any other questions?
Thank you.
If you do have any other questions that pop up that you didn't ask, I have a really simple email. I don't have any numbers. It's just D Mitchell. Or you can catch me in the hallway if I'm not staring off in space. Please feel free to email me, contact me if you have any other questions.
Dr. Mitchell, can I get a picture with everybody before you leave?
Sure.
Okay. Everybody.
No, everybody. I think we can do something to get
Really?
Where are we going here? Everybody hold up the cupcake.
Hey, short people have that problem.
Oh, we'll say
I know.
Maybe you should bend down. I'm good.
All right, everyone say for panel. Okay. Everybody say who's bar? Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell.
I have a question about your watch. Is that armor?
No.
Okay. Is that what you were trying to explain to me? Yes, because I just want my boyfriend a watch for Easter.
All right.
And I noticed the thing that it's almost the same as your armor watch.
Yeah, maybe they're not wild.
And I noticed his watch on the time. Oh, yeah.
I love this. Yeah.
And but I want to arm there. Like that kind of thing.
This one, the reason I got this, I like this one because I have the Apple Watch on the lady.
Oh, yeah.
This one, I love this. It's awesome.
That's what it looks really good. It's like the closure is like actual.
Yeah. That's what I'm doing. It's just one way to fight with it.
My boyfriend does. But I'm honestly, of all the things you can be thinking about. No, I
I mean, I'm okay with that, but I still would.
Oh, here, I got a bag for you.
Or I can.